right books can open your mind. Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and a little while ago, one of my subscribers made a comment about how I have some pretty unusual ideas, and they asked if I had a reading list of the ideas that influenced me. So I thought today what I'd do is give you my top 10 favorite books and sort of the key points I took from each of them. Now, you probably know that I absolutely love the book Chimpanzee Politics and all the power tactics that you can garner by studying our closest cousins. So before I start my list, I just want to be clear that I'm not including Chimpanzee Politics in this list of 10 books. All right, number 10, Blood on the Risers. This is the memoir of an airborne soldier who spent 36 months in Vietnam. The book was recommended to me by a specialist from the Ranger Regiment who was my bunkmate when I was at airborne school. At the time, I was an uncontracted cadet between my freshman and sophomore years of college, and to be honest, I knew absolutely nothing about the Army. But I learned some important life lessons from this book. To put it mildly, the author hated officers, and he was very clear about some of the things that they did that he disapproved of. So this book laid out some leadership principles for me very early on, and when I say leadership principles, these are the kinds of things that no doctrine in the world ever really addresses. Number 9, The Goal by Elihu Goldratt. This is a classic industrial engineering, philosophy book that's actually written in the form of a novel. See, I worked at a paper plate manufacturing plant for about 4 or 5 years after I got off of active duty and before I got called up for the global war on terror. And it was the company's chief operating officer who recommended this book to me. The big takeaway was how to identify a bottleneck in a process and the series of steps that you have to take to break that bottleneck. And then how to deal with the inevitable consequence of eliminating a bottleneck, which is that a new bottleneck forms. Maybe even more than these steps, the book addresses how you have to deal with the human side of making process changes. And it's one of the reasons I roll my eyes whenever somebody starts talking about low-hanging fruit. Number 8 is Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. I got this one off a friend's bookshelf. He had been given it as a graduation gift and had never opened it. And I'll admit that it is a pretty intense book if you try to start at page 1 and just read your way through it. But it's actually written as a bunch of snippets, mostly historical examples of people who are trying to accumulate or hold power. So it's really easy to kind of flip through this book and find examples of how people dealt with situations that might be similar to what you're dealing with. And the author provides plenty of counterexamples, and he makes it clear that in the game of power, the field is always shifting. Number 7 is The Richest Man in Babylon by George Clason. This is an old book, and it was recommended to me by my grandfather when he first started introducing me to the idea of financial planning. The book itself is written like a collection of discovered ancient documents. The main point of the book is save 10% of your income and put that money to work for you. But the idea that really stuck with me is that you don't have to be a free man to be able to apply this principle. Everybody has a master, and that shouldn't stop you from trying to pursue a better life. Number 6 is a book by Jared Diamond, but it is not his famous Guns, Germs, and Steel. I mean, that's a great book, but at some point I mentioned it to somebody and they turned me on to another book by the same author called Collapse: How Societies Choose to Succeed and Fail. This book lays out dozens of examples of how societies or organizations fail and then fade away. What's interesting about these situations is that failure is rarely the result of some single colossal mistake. Organizational collapse unfolds over a long period of time, and all along the way there are small decisions that appear to be beneficial in the short term, but eventually they contribute to the collapse. There's your low-hanging fruit again. Number 5 is Machiavelli's The Prince, and you can blame my college debate coach for this one. I don't know what he was thinking, but I really like this book. The big idea I take away from it is do not make an enemy if you cannot destroy that enemy completely. In a lot of cases, you're better off with kind of a lukewarm, distrustful ally than somebody who actually has a grudge against you. Number 4 is World War Z by Max Brooks. I kind of like how this one got recommended to me. Like at some point I had to go to this social event that was being hosted at the house of a 3-star general. So I did a little digging and I found that there was this book he recommended called Soldiers and Ghosts. So I grabbed a copy, I read it. It's an okay book. And then at the event, the general bumped into me and I commented on the book and I asked him if he had any other recommendations. And this man, this military professional, he gets the sneakiest look on his face. He looks over his shoulders and he says, World War Z, but don't tell anybody that I recommended it to you and don't tell anybody that you read it. I got 2 things out of that book that you really don't get from the movie. Number 1, when you're engaged in some kind of existential conflict, your military has to behave distinctly differently than when you're having conflicts of choice. And number 2, and in fact the one that's more practical, is always listen for the faraway screams of approaching trouble. Trouble comes like a thunderstorm. You can hear it approaching and you should not ignore the warning signs. Number 3 is Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. I go back to this one year after year, and if you haven't read it, that's fine by me, because that just means that I have a whole bag full of tricks that you don't even know exist. Number 2 is Looking Out for Number 1 by Robert Ringer. My broker recommended this to me back when I was trying to make a go of being a real estate salesman. And to be honest, this is a weird book. The author has a strange self-image. And what you get from the book are these fragments of his mental model of how the world works. For instance, Ringer says, everybody is out to steal your cookies. What makes people different is how honest they are with themselves about that. Some people just say it in the open. I'm here to get as much from you that I possibly can. Some people know it, they just don't say it. And if you ever call it on them, they'll be like, come on, that's how the game is played. I thought you knew. But the third group of people do not admit to themselves that they are out to steal other people's cookies. And if you complain about it to them, they like to make it seem like the whole reason you lost your cookies is your fault, not theirs. Ringer convinced me that the easiest people to deal with are the first group, and the most terrible to deal with are the third. So that brings me to my all-time favorite book, The Origins of Political Order by Francis Fukuyama. A Chinese graduate student recommended this to me on a bus ride one day. It's kind of a weighty book, and it trickles out its gems slowly, but wow, are they good points. This is an incredibly good look at history and politics and geopolitical power. And one of the reasons that I like this one is because there's this phenomenon that is played out over and over in different societies as they try to deal with the question of how do you compensate people for military service. Historically, the big issue has been with the top brass, but the way the U.S. compensates soldiers means that this pattern is starting to play out even among the most junior enlisted. The pattern is that in the early stages of a society, they give non-hereditary rights and privileges to their military leaders. You can kind of think of these as lands and titles. And what the military elite tries to do with varying degrees of success is they try to convert these lands and titles into hereditary family possessions. Now, think about the Montgomery GI Bill and the pension. Both of them are non-hereditary. But the 9/11 GI Bill, hereditary. Of course, the pension isn't likely to become hereditary, but I think that's one of the big challenges we face. How do you convert a non-hereditary income stream into a hereditary asset? I like that goal. Now, you probably noticed that all of my top 10 favorite books were recommended to me. So, what books would you recommend? Put your recommendations in the comments. And in the meantime, watch this video to see why finding good financial advice might be harder than you'd expect.